In 1953, anti-apartheid revolutionary Nelson Mandela wrote an article for the publication Liberation, entitled Searchlight on the Liberal Party. In it, he criticized the formation of the Liberal Party, consisting of white liberals who opposed apartheid in South Africa, but who did not go far enough to support universal franchise for black citizens. At the time, the party's constitution specified that they believed in extending political rights only to those they called quote-unquote suitably qualified persons. In response, Mandela wrote that, in South Africa, where the entire population is almost split into two hostile camps in consequence of the policy of racial discrimination, there can be no middle course. The fault of the liberals, and this spells their doom, is to attempt to strike just such a course. He went on to write later in the article that the Liberal Party is essentially reactionary in content, and that they stand not for the freedom of the people, but for the adoption of more subtle systems of oppression and exploitation. I should mention that the Liberal Party eventually changed its position on voting rights in the 1960s, with many of its members defecting to the Progressive Party, which continued to oppose universal franchise for black citizens. Be that as it may, the question raised by Mandela's criticism of the party back in the 1950s is whether his warning is only applicable to the situation of white liberals in apartheid South Africa, or whether it can be extended to the entire ideology of liberalism itself. Is his claim that liberals are essentially reactionary in content and want to adopt more subtle systems of oppression and exploitation something that we can still say today? In this video, I want to expose the dark and forgotten history of liberalism, including its shameful role in slavery and colonialism. I will make the case that it is not a philosophy that advocates for the complete liberation from subjugation, but reforms to make the system of oppression somewhat gentler and more palatable. I will showcase the consistent moral failings of historical liberalism to its modern-day counterpart. In the end, I hope to prove that Nelson Mandela was right to distrust liberals. First, what exactly is liberalism? For many illiterate right-wingers, liberalism means woke politics, identity politics, or big government. For left-wing critics like the legendary folk singer Phil Oakes, liberals are 10 degrees to the left of center in good times, 10 degrees to the right of center if it affects them personally. But let's dissect the definitions laid out by the defenders of liberalism. According to CNN commentator Fareed Zakaria, the ideology stands for, above all, the rights of the individual and against the power of the church and the state. Bill Maher, another television commentator, has defined liberal principles as freedom of speech, freedom to practice any religion you want without fear of violence, freedom to leave a religion, equality for women, equality for minorities, including homosexuals. Harvard University legal scholar Cass Sunstein similarly lists that liberals believe in 6 things: freedom, human rights, pluralism, security, the rule of law, and democracy. In a less broad definition, Jonathan Rauch, a contributing writer to The Atlantic magazine, argues that the central philosophy of liberalism is that all persons are born free and equal. There is, however, a problem with these definitions, particularly in their claims that liberalism is pluralist or egalitarian. Modern liberals ignore or misread the fact that the founders of liberalism itself would most likely disagree with those very tenets. Take, for instance, the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, who is widely regarded as the father of liberalism. He's still often cited by modern liberals, with Jonathan Rauch writing that the elements of modern liberalism are all there in John Locke's worked-out theory. John Locke is credited with advancing the social contract theory and writing that revolt is the right of the people against tyrannical governments. A proponent of limited government and the separation of the church and state, Locke was one of the most influential philosophers for the founding fathers of the United States. The American War of Independence was, after all, a liberal revolution, with George Washington himself promoting a quote-unquote wise and liberal government and a quote-unquote liberal system of policy. But a careful reading of John Locke reveals many limiting conditions interlaced among his ideas on individual liberty. Moreover, these may explain why the patriots in the American Revolution were drawn to his ideas and were able to fight for liberal principles, while justifying slavery and westward expansion at the same time. In his most influential work, which makes the case for representative government, Locke argues that the principles of equality only applies to creatures of the same species and rank, so long as the Lord and Master of them all should not set one above another. So, according to Locke, who are the people that did not meet the criteria for equality? It is actually quite a long list. For one, Native Americans, or what he called wild Indians, in his own words, had not joined with the rest of mankind and are excluded from those who can have the right to equality. Locke described natives as wild savage beasts, with whom men can have no society nor security, and concluded that they therefore may be destroyed. In addition to writing off Native Americans from having any rights, as an English nationalist, Locke also viewed Ireland as having a population of quote-unquote brigands that needed a despotic ruler to control them. When it came to the British working classes who could not afford to take care of themselves, he believed that poor children would be kept in much better order, be better provided for, and from infancy be inured to work, which is no small consequence to the making of them sober and industrious all their lives after, and went so far as to say that all children above 3 years old be taken off from their parents. Locke also supported violating human rights for victims of British conquest and imperialism. Captives taken in a just war are by right of nature subjected to the absolute dominion and arbitrary power of their masters. These men, having, as I say, forfeited their lives and with it their liberties, and lost their estates, and being in a state of slavery, not capable of any property, cannot in that state be considered as any part of civil society. So, as we see, the father of liberalism himself contradicts the claim that liberalism is pluralist or egalitarian. Locke certainly advocated for a philosophy that promoted individualism and liberty, but with asterisks. For him, the rights of man were privileges reserved for the upper echelons of society, in other words, white male property owners. While they opposed the absolute rule of monarchs, liberals like Locke still stood for a hierarchical society, just slightly reformed to grant some entitlements for those in the exclusive upper middle class. Now, some modern defenders of liberal principles may argue that John Locke was a quote-unquote classical liberal, and that liberalism has evolved since the 17th century. They may say that the ideology is now more consistent with the virtues of egalitarianism and pluralism. In fact, many present-day advocates of liberalism claim that their philosophy was pivotal to the cause of racial equality and the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. Jonathan J. Bean from the Independent Institute, for instance, has argued that classic liberals or libertarians were activists for abolishing slavery. David Boaz from the Cato Institute has written that by the spread of liberalism, the ancient practices of slavery and serfdom were finally ended. Jonathan Rauch of The Atlantic magazine similarly echoed the same sentiment, saying bluntly that liberalism brought an end to slavery. It is true that in the 19th century, liberalism adopted a new line of thought, utilitarianism, a school of thought widely associated with the liberal philosopher Jeremy Bentham. As a champion of policies that provided the greatest good for the majority of people, Bentham is widely credited as a pioneer of welfare economics and the shaping of the social safety net. But there's a great moral failing with Jeremy Bentham in that, like the liberals in apartheid South Africa that Nelson Mandela criticized, he still believed in the adoption of more subtle systems of oppression and exploitation. When it came to the issue of slavery, Bentham was hardly an abolitionist as we like to understand the term. Instead of calling for the immediate and complete end to slavery, Bentham argued for a gradual conferral of freedom. He proposed that slaves be emancipated by degrees through a lottery system, in which only 1/10 of the enslaved could be freed, but only after their masters had died. Bentham wrote that emancipation need not be suddenly carried into effect by a violent revolution. In finding a middle road between the oppressor and the oppressed, he argued that slave owners should be compensated for their quote-unquote lost property, writing that, instead of rendering emancipation burdensome to the master, it ought, as much as possible, be rendered advantageous to him. The incremental approach to reducing slavery in steps, rather than completely eliminating the abhorrent practice, was endorsed by other liberals in the 19th century. For example, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French liberal politician famous for writing Democracy in America, detested slavery, but he also took a middle ground approach to resolving the issue. De Tocqueville said that he was strongly opposed to the abolitionist party, and that he believed that it was premature and dangerous to abolish slavery in countries where this abominable institution has always existed. Like Bentham, he argued that we should doubtless only proceed to the abolition of slavery with care and moderation. Faced with these embarrassing temporizations, which call for care and moderation in addressing something as horrific as slavery, modern liberals may now respond by claiming that their ideology has again moved on from that. Just as Locke gets categorized under classical liberalism, modern liberals will similarly bracket 19th century philosophers like Bentham and de Tocqueville, insisting that they do not represent their views. They will say that 20th and 21st century liberalism is different, and that it does, in fact, stand for egalitarianism and pluralism. Well then, if that is the case, then why do so many modern liberal leaders continue to lay claim to the legacy of the liberals of the past? Men like Locke, Bentham, and de Tocqueville, when they make the case for their ideology. Hillary Clinton, for instance, has quoted de Tocqueville repeatedly throughout her political career, and as provocative as this may sound, it would not be a stretch to think that had Clinton been alive in the 19th century, she would have taken de Tocqueville's position that would be best in moderating the institution of slavery rather than eliminating it. In February 2026, Hillary Clinton made an interesting boast, one that strikes an unsettling and familiar chord with the tentative and morally restrictive positions of her idol Alexis de Tocqueville. She bragged about how more people were deported under my husband and Barack Obama than during Donald Trump's 2 terms as president. But she added, of course, that those Democratic presidents were humane because they did it without killing American citizens. Clearly, it is Clinton's perspective that murdering US citizens is a step too far, but she misconstrues the difference in degree as a difference in kind. She seems to be saying that because deportations under President Clinton and Obama were less violent, they were somehow acceptable. In other words, the process of ripping undocumented families apart can still be justified as an instance of a more subtle systems of oppression and exploitation. This is the dreaded middle course that Mandela had warned against. Beyond politicians like Hillary Clinton, liberal intellectuals today have also not distanced themselves enough from the liberalism of the past centuries. Take the most prominent and famous modern-day philosopher of utilitarianism, Princeton University professor Peter Singer, who stated that his ethics is close to that of Jeremy Bentham, who focused on reducing suffering and increasing well-being. Singer has been a favorite intellectual for liberal millionaires and billionaires in Silicon Valley, including the co-founder of Facebook, Dustin Moskowitz, as well as for the disgraced crypto entrepreneur Sam Bankman-Fried. It is easy to understand why so many elites adore Singer. He has written how bankers are more noble than social workers, since the rich can give a lot away to charity and can save many lives. He has even called Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett the most effective altruists in history. In the same way that Bentham cautioned against violent revolution in an attempt to end slavery, Singer has argued against the bottom-up approach of social movements fighting for a more equitable society. When it came to the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement and its opposition to rampant corruption and theft of the financial industry, which had crashed the economy, Singer argued that there was no positive benefits he could see in protesting. He stated that he doesn't think that Wall Street is necessarily harmful at all. Just as Bentham scrupled over a sudden end to slavery out of the concern for the interests of slave owners, Singer believes that world poverty should be solved through incremental charity. Rejecting the idea of class warfare to overthrow the elites, he takes the dreaded middle road between the rich and the rest of us. Whether it is Hillary Clinton laying claim to de Tocqueville or Peter Singer expanding the work of Bentham, the reality is that liberalism hasn't changed all much since the time of John Locke. It has consistently been a centrist ideology navigating between the oppressor and the oppressed. Its proponents are not in favor of total absolutist tyranny from a monarch or a dictator, but at the same time, they will insist on liberty and freedom only for some people, or what they might call suitably qualified persons. They address the subjugation of certain groups with the reformist solutions, advocating a gradual, incremental solution. Instead of calling for a complete and immediate liberation from oppression, Whether from slavery or apartheid, they seek a less disruptive approach. This persistent problem with liberalism can be seen in its response to some of the most pressing issues of the present era. When it comes to the recent genocide in Gaza, there have been liberal Zionist lobbying groups like J Street who oppose right-wing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but diverge from those in the Palestinian Solidarity movement in their calls for boycotts and sanctions against Israel. They act in a similar way to the liberals during apartheid in the 1980s. Back then, white progressive politicians like Helen Suzman fought for improving prison conditions for revolutionaries like Nelson Mandela, but argued against international solidarity efforts to boycott or sanction South Africa. Donald Trump's authoritarian crackdown on undocumented immigrants in the United States offers another instance in which we see the insufficient actions of modern liberals. While Democratic opposition leader Hakeem Jeffries has voiced criticism of ICE, he has stopped short for calling it to be abolished. He has advocated, instead, for things like better training or body cameras. While immigration activists as well as Democratic voters themselves have been calling for the complete dismantling of ICE, Democratic leaders have tempered their response with the classic liberal spin. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, for instance, has said that he only wants to abolish Trump's ICE. Similarly, the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, called for ICE to leave his city, but said he opposed eliminating ICE altogether. Here again, we see the liberal double standard for supporting liberty for some, but not for others. Frey seems perfectly fine with immigration officials terrorizing people in other places, but just not in his own city. Recent polls have shown an overwhelming majority of Democratic voters think that their elected officials are not doing enough to oppose the reactionary agenda of President Trump. Clearly, this is a criticism of Trump, but it is also a rebuke of liberalism, that is the core ideology of the Democratic Party. No one wants gradualism when the people demand liberation. The middle ground approach, as Nelson Mandela warned, spells the doom of liberals. It is why Democrats lost to Trump in 2 presidential elections. In an interview back in October 2025 with Jon Stewart, Kamala Harris sounded defeatist in admitting that in opposing the Trump regime, it is never satisfying to say we've got to be incremental, and I'm not advocating incrementalism, but until we win back majorities in the Senate and the House and take the White House, that may just be where we are. In the video, Stewart has his mouth open, looking like he died inside while listening to Harris say we should settle for incrementalism. Written on Stewart's face was the painful recognition that, at the end of the day, liberalism, despite its promises of egalitarianism and pluralism, will not save us.